For those of you waiting to see one of the big names go down, this one's for you. Because the talk of the town is one ballsy mammal, time minus 150 million years. A wiped out Earth, forests buried, lakes filled with ash, everything swallowed by volcanic mud. One moment, there's life. The next, silence. Basically, if you ask the animals there,
how are you feeling? Terrible. Obviously.
Now think about this. Millions of years later, what do you expect to find? Dinosaurs locked in combat? A predator chasing its prey? Skeletons frozen mid-run? That's the story we're used to. The version of the past we think we understand. But not this time. Because what they found makes no sense. A mammal attacking a dinosaur. Not hiding or running. Attacking. We could explain it, use the right terms, keep it scientific, but strip all that away. This thing had guts. Way more than it should. It's picking a fight it has absolutely no business picking. Meet Repenomamus. The scientific name is less accurate, but more publishable. And the strangest part, this isn't a reconstruction. It isn't a guess. This actually happened, preserved in a single moment of chaos, buried so fast, the fight never even finished. And at the center of it is a mammal that rewrites everything we thought we knew about the age of dinosaurs. Let's get to some details about our suspicious fossil. It has a problem. The main problem is that it exists, and that's why our guy is brought in for forgery. When paleontologists first looked at it, they saw two animals tangled together, a dinosaur and a mammal, not side by side, but rather locked in a fight. The mammal on top of the dinosaur, with its claw gripping. Fossils like this, they get faked, pieces glued together, stories manufactured, especially in places where fossils are valuable. So, who wouldn't get suspicious when facing this fossil? No scientist looks at something like this and says, yeah, that's real. We found something valuable. They began testing it. They checked the rock, check how the bones got into the matrix, check if anything feels off. And in this case, everything lines up. The bones are embedded deep into the same rock. The grip, the bite, it cuts into the sediment itself. Meaning this didn't happen after death. This happened before everything was buried. Which brings us to an interesting question. What kind of event can freeze a moment like that? Not hours or days later, but instantly. The answer is violent. A volcanic debris flow, a lahar. A wave of mud, ash, rock, moving fast enough to bury everything in its path. No time to escape, no time to let go. Just one final moment, captured forever. But this fossil doesn't exist in isolation. The context also has context. It comes from a place where moments like this happen again and again and again. Early Cretaceous China, a region known today as the Jehol ecosystem. A landscape of lakes, forests, and constant volcanic activity. Ash falls, water fills, life returns. And then another eruption, another wave, another layer. Over time, this becomes a system. Animals die suddenly. Bodies are buried fast. Skeletons stay intact. Even small, fragile creatures, things that normally disappear, are preserved in detail. Feathers, fur, stomach contents. This is why a moment like that fight can even exist. Now, at first glance, the mammal at the center of this isn't impressive at all. Not a giant, not some apex predator, just a mammal. But look closer. This thing is built different. Short body, thick limbs, a head that looks almost too big, for the size of course, and a jaw. That's where things start to get interesting. Heavy, powerful, packed with teeth, made for one thing: meat. Our guy Repenomamus has two species. One, Repenomamus robustus, roughly the size of a large cat, or maybe 6 kilos. And then there's the bigger one, Repenomamus giganticus, over a meter long, pushing well past 10 kilos. For a mammal living in that age of dinosaurs, that's abnormal, because mammals at this time, they're supposed to be small, shrew-sized, staying out of trouble. That's the rule. Repenomamus doesn't follow that rule. Not even close. Its limbs aren't built for speed. This isn't something chasing prey across open ground. The body sits low, stable, close to the ground. The limbs are strong, built for control, not distance. This is the kind of animal that doesn't rely on speed, because it doesn't need to. It gets close, and when it commits, it holds on. Now let's bring the fossil back in. Let's start with the dinosaur. You can see the full body layout. Head forward, spine aligned, limbs positioned naturally. Nothing unusual there. This is what you expect from a preserved animal. Now bring in the mammal. Smaller body, lower profile, but placed directly over the dinosaur. Not beside it, not separated over it. Look at the limbs. The forelimbs aren't relaxed. They're angled inward, pressed against the dinosaur's body. That's contact. Now the torso. The weight is forward, centered. This isn't a passive positioning. That's pressure. And then the skull. This is where it becomes clear. The jaws are closed directly onto the dinosaur, locked. Now step back. Two skeletons, fully articulated, maintaining position, not scattering, no separation. That only happens if everything is buried together at the same time, which means this isn't staged. This isn't assembled. This is preserved exactly where it happened. But this fossil isn't the only clue. There's another specimen, same animal, different story. Because this time, the detail is inside. Within the body, there are bones. Small, recognizable, contained. Remains of a juvenile dinosaur, which tells you something immediately. This animal isn't just scavenging randomly. There's a pattern here. Now go back to the skull. The teeth, sharp, thick, built to hold. The jaw, deep, reinforced, designed to handle resistance. And the body, low, powerful, stable. Everything about this animal points in one direction. Capability. Capability to deal with something that fights back. But here's where things get careful, because evidence has limits. Did it hunt dinosaurs? Possibly. Did it scavenge them? Also possible. Could it do both? Very likely. The fossil shows a fight. The stomach shows consumption. But it doesn't show frequency. It doesn't show behavior over time. It shows moments. And from those moments, we built interpretations, not certainties. So when you put everything together, the teeth, the jaw, the body, the gut contents, and the fossil itself, you don't get a complete answer. But you get something better. You get a crack in a very old assumption. Because mammals in the age of dinosaurs weren't all hiding. Some of them were willing to fight back. And that leaves one question. What exactly was this animal doing in a world we thought it didn't belong in a world ruled by dinosaurs? Because whatever the answer is, it doesn't fit the story we've been telling. To understand what this animal was doing, you first have to understand the world it lived in. And this was not some quiet, stable ecosystem. It was a place constantly being interrupted. Volcanoes reshaped the landscape. Ash fell from the sky. Lakes filled with sediments. Life returned. Then the cycle started again. And this matters because those interruptions did something extraordinary. They preserved moments that normally would have been vanished. In most environments, small bodies break apart. Scavengers scatter them. Decay erases the details. But here, that process was cut short. And that is why this mammal is still here at all. But the real question is not just how it was preserved. It is what it was doing in that world. Because this was a world dominated by dinosaurs. And mammals, at least in the older version of the story, were supposed to be small, hidden, and insignificant. This animal does not fit the picture. It breaks it. And that is what makes it important. To understand why, you have to look more closely at Jehol itself. This animal lived in the Jehol ecosystem of early Cretaceous China, a landscape shaped by lakes, forests, and repeated volcanic activity. Now, that does not mean the place was in constant chaos every single day. Most of the time, it was a functioning ecosystem. Water, vegetation, small animals, dinosaurs, mammals, all moving through the same world together. Then, every so often, disaster interrupted that normal life. Ash spread across the landscape, freshwater systems filled with fine sediments, and in some places, volcanic debris moved fast enough to bury animals almost where they were. And that kind of burial changes everything. Because when burial happens this quickly, bodies do not stay exposed for long. They are not pulled apart in the usual way. They are sealed before scavenging and decay can destroy the evidence. And that is one of the main reasons Jehol is so famous. It does not just preserve bones, it preserves posture, articulation, gut contents, sometimes even delicate structures that usually disappear completely, basically the metadata. And that becomes especially important with small animals, because in most fossil settings, these small ones are the first to vanish. They leave behind fragments, hints, pieces that force you to guess. But here, they remain. Instead of vague possibilities, you get placement. And sometimes, instead of anatomy, you get behavior caught in the middle of happening, caught in 4K geologically. That is a major difference, and the report makes another important distinction inside the environments. Not all Jehol fossils were preserved the same way. Some come from lake deposits, where animals were preserved as flattened, almost two-dimensional bodies. Others, especially those from the Liaoning beds, are preserved in a more three-dimensional form inside volcanic sediments. And that difference matters more than it might seem, because it tells you Jehol was not preserving life through one single process. It had multiple modes of preservation depending on the setting and the kind of burial event involved. Liaoning is especially important here. These deposits are associated with sudden mass mortality style events and are often described as preserving animals close to where they died. And that is why the site is so often compared to a prehistoric Pompeii. Not because the world was always exploding, but because when disaster came, it could stop life fast enough for an ordinary moment to become a fossil. And really, that is the power of this environment. It creates interruptions. Life is moving normally. Then the ecosystem crashes into it. Ash, mud, debris, rapid burial, and the result is a fossil record made of snapshots. Not a continuous film of everyday life. Sharp, violent still frames. Each one preserving a tiny fragment of a much larger ecosystem. And that ecosystem was unusually rich in small-bodied animals. Jehol preserved mammals, feathered dinosaurs, early birds, and other delicate vertebrates with exceptional detail. That changes the picture completely, because now the dinosaur world no longer looks like a stage occupied by giants. It starts to look crowded, layered, interactive, a world full of overlap. And that is where the answer begins. When you ask what this animal was doing in a dinosaur-dominated world, part of the answer is that it lived in one of the rare environments capable of preserving the parts of that world we usually lose. Without Jehol.Repenomamus might have been little more than a skull, a few teeth, maybe a partial skeleton. Instead, it appears inside a far-richer setting, a world where posture, gut contents, and preservation all work together. And because of that, it becomes more than just a mammal fossil. It becomes evidence inside an ecosystem that suddenly feels real. So the environment here is not just background. It is the reason this story can be told at all. And that is really where this section lands. Jehol matters because it changes what fossil records is capable of showing us. In most places, small animals disappear first. Bodies break apart, details vanish, and whatever story was there gets reduced to fragments. Here, that process is interrupted. Ash falls quickly, sediment seals rapidly, and moments survive that normally never would. That is why Jehol keeps producing fossils that feel almost impossibly complete. And for Repenomamus, that changes everything. Because before we even ask what it was capable of, or how often it behaved this way, one thing is already clear. This world was more complicated than the version we inherited. And the rocks of Jehol are the reason we can see that at all. Now the harder question begins. What can we actually claim from the evidence? And where do we need to stop? We have come a long way in this story. From a fossil that appears to capture a violent encounter between Repenomamus and a dinosaur, to the discoveries that revealed more about the animal, its body, and the world it lived in. And by this point, the temptation is obvious. You want to make the leap. You want to say exactly what this animal was doing, what kind of hunter it was, how often it behaved like this, what role it played in the ecosystem. But this is the point where the evidence forces us to slow down. Because this fossil, it gives us a moment, a mammal in direct contact with a dinosaur, a scene that cuts against the older image of early mammals as small, timid, and ecologically unimportant. And that alone matters. But a fossil, no matter how dramatic, does not explain itself. It shows you what happened, not necessarily why. And that distinction is everything. Because once you ask what this interaction actually means, the certainty starts to narrow. Was this active predation? Was it a scavenging? Was it some other kind of struggle that we would not immediately recognize? The fossil cannot fully answer that. It could have been nature's clickbait. And just as importantly, it cannot tell us how common this behavior was. That is the real limit of the evidence. Repenomamus was clearly not a fragile, insignificant mammal. Its anatomy tells us that much. And it had strong jaws, powerful limbs, a body built with enough robustness to handle forceful interactions and meat consumption. So we are not looking at an animal that was incapable of dealing with large prey. But capability is not the same thing as proof of routine behavior. And that matters, because one of the easiest mistakes in paleontology is taking an extraordinary fossil and turning it into an everyday rule. Jehol preserves disruptions. It freezes sudden events. It captures life in the middle of being interrupted by ash, sediment, debris, and rapid burial. And that is exactly why these fossils are so informative. But it is also why they have to be handled carefully. Because what gets preserved in this kind of setting may not be ordinary life at all. It may be the exception. Maybe a real-life Mission Impossible. The accident the crisis, the rare interaction that only became visible because everything stopped fast enough for it to survive. And that means we are often looking at sharp evidence, but narrow evidence. These stomach contents help push the story further. One specimen contains bones from a juvenile dinosaur, and that is important because it confirms that Repenomamus ate dinosaurs. Not in theory, not by a vague inference, directly. But even that does not settle the whole question, because eating a dinosaur does not automatically mean it hunted that dinosaur. It could have scavenged. And while bite marks or signs of violent contact may suggest aggression, they still do not fully resolve intent. That is where the uncertainty remains. So, what can we really say with confidence? We can say that Repenomamus was carnivorous. We can say that it consumed dinosaur material. We can say that it was stronger, more formidable, and behaviorally more complex than traditional image of early mammals would suggest. And we can say that this fossil directly challenges the old idea that mammals in the age of dinosaurs were always confined to the shadows, surviving only as passive, insignificant creatures. The idea does not hold up cleanly anymore. But beyond that, the ground becomes less stable. We cannot say with certainty that Repenomamus regularly hunted dinosaurs. We cannot say this interaction was typical. We cannot say how often mammals like this confronted larger animals, or whether this behavior was common, opportunistic, or exceptionally rare. And that is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Because the most important fossils do not just give answers, they also expose the edge of what we know. And that is exactly what happens here. Repenomamus clearly was not just a small mammal hiding underfoot in the dinosaur world. It was something more disruptive than that, something more capable, something that does not fit comfortably inside the older model. But exactly how far that difference goes, that is where the evidence stops. And that is where we have to stop with it. So in the end, this fossil does two things at once. It reveals a more complex picture of mammalian life in Cretaceous, and it leaves the biggest question partially open. Not whether Repenomamus mattered. Clearly it did. But what role it played, how often it played it, and how representative this moment really was. Those are the questions the fossil raises, without ever completely closing them. And that may be the most important point of all. Because sometimes, the real value of a fossil is not that it finished the story. It is that it forces the story to become more honest.